Okay, so hello and welcome. So this is going to start off with a little bit of an introduction and disclaimer that this is going to be a little bit of a one-off video, a little bit of something I've been working on for, I'm starting to record this in late June, and I think I've been working on this since sometime in February. So this is a big culmination of work, and the warning being is that this is going to be much longer. This isn't going to be recorded in one sitting like most of the other videos have been. So that being said, if the sound or voice changes a little bit, it's kind of just the nature of the beast of not recording this in one sitting, so there's that warning. Also, this is going to be, if you've ever seen the Well, There's Your Problem podcast, kind of more in that vein of investigating a very deep-seated problem and hopefully coming to something of a much wider social phenomena that has basically the railways have had a microcosm of that. So yeah, a little bit of a ripoff. Sorry, not sorry. It's kind of inspired and whatever. But anyways, we are going to be talking about the decline and fall of the Granger railroads in the United States. So to start off, what were the Granger railroads, which is going to be the question for some people. The Granger railroads were railroads that served the Midwestern parts of the United States. They generally connected to Chicago or St. Louis or some other major Midwestern city, with railroads that ran in the East Coast and on the West Coast. They were mostly serving agricultural states in the middle of the country and also kind of serving as a bridge between the Eastern and Western systems. Notable lines that we will be talking about today include the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, the Chicago Northwestern, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, and the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. Those are 4 different railroads. Again, it was a naming convention to have like every city this railway ran through to having the name in the name of the railroad. I don't know why that's a thing. I will have to look into that, but as of time of beginning to record this, I don't know why. Comment sections, that might also be a good place for you to come in and chime in as to why that was a thing. Guessing advertising, possibly currying political favor, all of the above, who knows. These routes through history generally concentrate on serving states such as Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Minnesota. Beyond serving these states, they, as I said, also served as bridges between Eastern and Western railroads, so connecting like the Pennsylvania Railroad to the Southern Pacific, and so on and so forth. This meant that the Grangers had a history of being mostly middlemen, which was great for a time. Things would be produced in the east, transported by rail to St. Louis or Chicago, transported by a Granger to somewhere in the middle of the country, and then handled by the likes of the Union Pacific, Northern Pacific, Southern Pacific, or the Great Northern, all the way to the West Coast. And the Western railroads would bring their agricultural products and mineral products and what have you from west to the middle to the east, being handled by Grangers in the middle. So this is going to be more case study and series of case studies on the Grangers, so it's not just going to be concise in a sense. There is a whole point to all of this, but we're going to let the strings wander where they be and where they will before we get to the whole point of all of this. So again, this is going to be a little bit, I don't know, it's going to seem like it's going to spaghetti a little bit, but it's not. Possibly pancake. I'm not really sure what metaphor I'm going for here. But to put it bluntly, I will be doing a little bit of a history, very, very, very brief overview of each railway that we're going to be talking about, how they got going, a bit how they handled the post-World War II world, and a bit how they handled themselves during the deregulation, mega-merger, dark days of the 70s time period. And I also won't be going into 100% nitty-gritty detail about how each line was built to where, the various main lines and all that stuff, and how like some railway absorbed the East Corn Belt and Nowhere Railroad that made up their system and all the nitty-gritty. Usually that's what I reserve the normal videos for, so just going to say the nitty-gritty of how each line was built not happening. This would make this video way longer than it probably will end up being in the long run, so but this is just mostly a general warning of I'm going to be skipping over some bits of history, so if you're like, this is details ignored. So this is going to be the segment where I talk a little bit about the Rock Island and how it got going. As mentioned previously, I've made a few videos on the Rock Island and how it got it going, how it declined, and various other shenanigans, so I'm more or less going to gloss over a lot of the history instead of restating it. Kind of started that as a policy. I'm not going to restate the entirety of history in a video that I've already talked about unless something is specifically relevant to the case at hand. So anyways, the Rock Island was one of the first Granger routes that started off strong and stumbled almost as quickly as it got going. It was the first railroad to bridge the Mississippi, but it was the third to reach Omaha. As mentioned in a past video, this became a pattern in the Rock Island's history. It would serve the same areas as the CB&Q, the Chicago Northwestern, and to some extent the Santa Fe, but generally arrived at these places after the other three already had. This ended up not necessarily being bad for the Rock Island, for a time at least. The Rock Island basically acted as a middleman between Chicago, Texas, and California, working with the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and others, but mostly the Southern Pacific from what I've managed to gather. They also had a very close relationship with agricultural producers in the Midwest along their railroads. This was a good arrangement until after World War II, when the Rock Island faced more competition from other forms of transportation and other railroads. Some of this led them competing more directly with other railroads, since you could truck your grain or what have you to a grain elevator or warehouse somewhere else and ship it over a different railroad that isn't immediately next to your farm. Another thing that was going on in the agricultural industry was massive farm consolidation in the 20th century, and that farm consolidation tended to hit the Grangers fairly hard. So to briefly discuss how this worked in the United States in the 20th century, U.S. farms at one point were mostly family farms, which meant one family and a small number of ranch hands living off the land and producing stuff for surplus at best. Most people were just subsistence farmers, which was a very standard thing and pretty much how the Midwest got settled. Generally, any surplus produce that wasn't consumed locally was shipped off to generally Chicago. There were still large operations, but they were fewer and farther between at this point. But between 1900 and World War II, there were about 6,000 farms in the United States, and they averaged about 2,000 acres per farm. So even by the 20th century, a lot of consolidation compared to the ethos of America. By 1960, that number had changed to about 4,000 farms with 4,000 acres each on average. And by 2000, the numbers had inverted to about 2,000 farms with 6,000 acres on average each, which meant that the railways lost a lot of their customer base. And remember that the farm as a business is the customer of the railroad, not each individual acre of land. So, again, declining customer base, which meant that the railroads were losing business, even though at this point more things were being produced and not less. But, again, fewer customers. This really hurt the Rock Island because they were dependent on agricultural customers to survive, along with being the middlemen between the Eastern and Western railroads, as mentioned before. The other side of the coin was that the Rock Island didn't have a huge through business either. The Rock Island handled some traffic from the UP at Omaha, but the Chicago Northwestern handled the largest share, and the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy also took a piece of the traffic. And there are other places they could pick up traffic, most notably the SP and Tucumcari. But I also think they had other interactions at like Eunice, Dallas, St. Louis with the Cotton Belt, and the Rio Grande in Colorado, as well as potentially the Milwaukee Road and Hill lines in the Twin Cities, along with the Union Pacific. But before we get into exactly how this did them in, we need to talk about the other railroads, because we're introducing all of them before we talk about their problems and successes. So the Milwaukee Road was another one of the Grangers that operated in the Midwest towards the Northwest. Geographically, it was a mirror of the Rock Island. The Milwaukee Road ran in the upper Midwest, and the Rock Island ran towards the south and southwest. The Milwaukee Road started in a similar manner. It was a railroad that connected Midwestern farmers with Chicago and other major market cities in the middle of the country, exchanging traffic with Eastern roads, and ran their own transcontinental line, along with getting some of the action in Omaha. The Milwaukee Road was also heavily dependent on agricultural traffic to generate revenue, so it was also affected by the consolidation and mechanization that led to there being fewer customers for these railroads, which meant less things to ship despite there being more volume produced. This meant that the Milwaukee Road and the Rock Island had a larger number of branch lines to serve, as time went on, more than they frankly needed to sustain their business. One anecdote I heard about the Milwaukee Road was that 14% of its mileage generated a little over a third of its overall revenue, which meant, financially speaking, at least, the Milwaukee Road had more capacity than it needed. This meant having a lot of physical capital to maintain and not necessarily enough money to maintain itself. This is also a problem for the Rock Island, but it had overall fewer of these routes throughout its territory. But the Milwaukee Road did attempt to create through traffic for itself by building the Pacific Extension, which reached the west coast at Seattle in 1909. This was an attempt for it to go from being a Granger to a transcontinental railroad. And this was a full 16 years after the Great Northern had done the same thing by completing its transcontinental main line from St. Paul to Seattle, and about a decade after Charles Elliott Perkins of the CB&Q determined that building another transcontinental railroad wouldn't be worth the risk in 1900, which is why the sale of the CB&Q and the Great Northern and Northern Pacific happened about a year or so later. And keep that in mind for further discussions down the road. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to talking about the Chicago Northwestern. The Chicago Northwestern pretty much started out the same way that the rest of the Grangers did. Its parts were originally chartered to connect various small towns to a major city, and during the height of construction of railroads following the Civil War up to the Panic of 1893, had a bunch of railroads consolidate into one that was the Chicago Northwestern. Not much more can be said about this other than its main markets were the northwest of Chicago, as the name implies. But there were milestones in its existence. It was one of the two major railroads to serve South Dakota, the other being the Milwaukee Road. It attempted to build a transcontinental route to northern California, but ultimately gave up and stopped construction near Lander, Wyoming, and maintained a very close relationship with the Union Pacific, of which the Chicago Northwestern always carried the largest freight from the UP out of Omaha, as well as was the sole handler of its passenger trains for 50 years between 1905 and 1955. And for reference, I did do a video about, or at least will, I'm not sure exactly a timeline as to when the Twin Cities 400 video will be out, but it will go a little bit more into the history about the Chicago Northwestern and how it got going. So next we'll talk about the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. On this channel we have investigated the CB&Q a lot, but to summarize, it grew from being a branch line to connect the town Burlington and Quincy to Chicago in a similar vein as the Rock Island, and it very quickly grew into a region-wide behemoth. The Burlington, like the Rock Island, had periods of growth and strong financial backing. The difference was the Burlington usually beat the Rock Island to the punch. Not only that, but it had a much more conservative management culture. For a good chunk of the Burlington's history, it was managed by John Murray Forbes and Charles Elliott Perkins, who were, if I believe correctly and read the sources correctly, were actually cousins. This long period of sound financial management and backing allowed it to grow and reach its potential. Not only that, but being the first to connect major markets also helps when it comes to marketing. So the Burlington, after 1901 and the intervention of James J. Hill, brought the CB&Q, the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, the Great Northern and Northern Pacific, along with the Colorado and Southern and its Texas chunk, into basically a syndicate. Hill, for a brief moment, owned the largest stake in the Great Northern, a controlling interest in the Northern Pacific, meaning most of it, and those two collectively split the SP&S and the CB&Q. The CB&Q was split 98%, not 100% like the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. And as mentioned, the Burlington had its own subsidiaries, such as the Colorado and Southern, which linked from Wyoming all the way down through Denver into Fort Worth, and had a joint subsidiary between Fort Worth and Galveston with the Rock Island. They also owned their own bus company for a brief time, Burlington Trailways. This enabled the CB&Q through its subsidiaries and syndicate members to connect farms and factories in the Midwest with mines and shipping in the Pacific Northwest, with its refining markets in Texas and along the Gulf. This was probably the most successful transportation syndicate in the U.S. west of the Mississippi, and this successful syndicate fully merged into one company in 1970, which was the Burlington Northern Railroad. So, to put it more bluntly, the Chicago Burlington and Quincy and the Chicago and Northwestern were the two more successful railroads that eventually made it past the dark days of the 70s. These two railways took two different paths with some overlap and some connections, but both of them lasted till the mega merger era instead of being liquidated like the Rock Island or the Milwaukee Road. Some of this is down to management practices and organization of each railroad. Some of them hit it lucky, and some of them just overall just had a just better, more sound business model. These practices are what, at least in my opinion, made a good chunk of the difference between the two that survived and the two that were liquidated. The Burlington was generally the first railroad to serve an area, at least the ones that it served, and being first meant you got the pick of the best routes. The Burlington routes were generally much more direct and along much more profitable corridors than the competing Rock Island routes were, and this is also true to some extent with the Milwaukee Road. The Burlington had a relatively dense network of Granger routes in the Midwest like most railways did, but looking at its map, most of its routes and networks seem to be more towards Nebraska than serving Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota, such as the Chicago and Northwestern and the Milwaukee Road, which isn't to imply that they had absolutely no branch lines in Iowa, just that Iowa wasn't their sole market, or at least their big market, or at least primary market, rather. One major point in the Burlington's history that also helped save it, or at least allow it to grow and expand, or whatever it is metaphor we're going with here, was the intervention of James J. Hill, along with Perkins being a very conservative business leader. Perkins had come to the conclusion sometime before the sale of his railroad to Hill that building another transcontinental line would be too financially risky, which is why he didn't attempt to build one after the Panic of 1893. For comparison, the Milwaukee Road was still studying the idea of the Pacific Extension at this point, and the Choctaw route was still being built between New Mexico and Memphis, which was later absorbed into the Rock Island. And the only other major route I can think of being built at this time was the Western Pacific's Feather River route, which also was breaking a monopoly and not challenging an entrenched duopoly like the Milwaukee Road was. The second point being that the Western Pacific Transcon would also be its main line, not one of its many lines. Just to put it bluntly, the Pacific Extension was always some far-flung outpost away from the core of the Milwaukee Road's business. But anyways, we'll get more into that in a second. Perkins, Hill, and Harriman probably saw the railroad industry as hitting its maturity in the mid-1890s and early 1900s. Another second point that I have to make, that I believe I made this in the Empire Builder video, but that the Great Northern also started out as a Granger route that extended itself west to Seattle. So Hill had the same idea as the Milwaukee Road, but it started several decades earlier, before the Milwaukee Road even got itself together to build its western extension. And also getting beaten to the punch is another thing the Rock Island and Milwaukee Road sort of share with each other. So let's talk a little bit about what the product life cycle is. The product life cycle is generally only applied to consumer products and sometimes services, but I'm going to apply this to an entire industry because industries also sort of go through their own life cycles, not just the products or services they sell. Railroads as an industry also went through a bit of a life cycle. So prior to the Civil War is when railroads were basically getting going. They were at their introduction, which means they were just starting to get going, and the big industries or other early adopters were starting to build and use railroads. They also enjoyed pretty steady growth from 1840 until the Civil War. Following the Civil War, the industry entered its growth phase, which is the period after westward expansion, and the period when most railway miles were built. This is a rough and tumble time where most companies rose and fell. A lot of new services and ancillary industries started churning, and this basically lasted until the Panic of 1893 set in and basically ended the growth phase of the railroad industry. And as I mentioned, there were still major construction projects in the railroad industry after that point. It's just that most construction seemed to have slowed down, if not entirely stopped, in following it. And the maturity phase is generally the most profitable phase of an industry. Well, rather in this case product, but I'm applying it to an industry. This is when the big players get bigger and stabilize, and at least on the scale of an industry, the industry starts doing its big things. In the case of the railroad, this, as I said, was the period of after 1893 up to generally the 50s. And this is the point where passenger trains started getting grand, railroads opened, hotels and resorts, the streamliners themselves were launched. And this is also a trend line of the whole industry. So even though the Depression rocked the world in the 30s and the railroads still went through the war, which kind of evened things out, and some railways were still growing, the decline phase didn't really come until after the war and somewhat into the 40s. And this is the period where companies basically start exiting the industry, which basically means, in the case of railroads, more or less just means going out of business or being absorbed and merged out of existence. And I would say for railways, this was basically after the launch of the Boeing 707 at the latest and the end of the Korean War at the earliest. I say give it kind of a range at this period because some railways kind of knew coming out of the Second World War that their days were numbered and were already kind of preparing for things to get worse. And it wasn't really until after like 1953 that most railways really saw the writing on the wall. The earliest, and some railways had already started battening down the hatches, and the 707, at least its launch, is more or less what killed passenger trains off, or at least made the decline be more terminal. So anyways, to get back to the railroads I was talking about, this means the leaders I mentioned figured out that the railways had saturated the market and that building more would largely just bury them in debt they would have a hard time digging themselves out of. So these railroads largely stopped expanding. What kept the Burlington going was that it was absorbed into the Hill Empire. This gave it guaranteed traffic across its network. The Hill lines only ran their traffic over the Burlington because they owned it, or not only, but mostly, which is why it was never hurting for through traffic. Couple this with the Burlington having strong online traffic as well. It hauled coal and minerals from Colorado around its system. It took farm produce to various markets and could take refined chemical products from Texas to pretty much anywhere in the country through its partners. Chicago Northwestern was a different story, but it did have some overlaps as well. It, like the other Granger railroads, had a dense web of branch lines throughout the upper Midwest, which was expensive to maintain, which quickly became a liability after World War II. They flirted with merging with the Rock Island and the Milwaukee Road in the 60s, but when the Milwaukee Road called off the merger in 1970, the management of the railroad decided to sell the railroad to its employees, which it finalized in 1972. Under their ownership, the Chicago Northwestern had strong leadership, which pursued a policy of abandoning unprofitable lines. This was done by selling the land off underneath the tracks or the routes to other companies. Through the 70s and early 80s, the Chicago Northwestern went from having over 12,000 miles of track to around 5,000. Also during this time, it bought the Rock Islands line from Kansas City to St. Paul from bankruptcy and abandoned their route between the two cities. And this was done despite the Rock Island being in worse shape than their track, physically speaking. But the engineering that went into the line was better, so it was worth fixing up and abandoning their own line. Chicago Northwestern also did a lot of interchange traffic with the UP at Omaha. And as I mentioned, they actually held the largest share of UP traffic. This, like the CB&Q, meant that they were always had enough revenue to maybe try not necessarily do well, but at least tread water while the entire industry was going through its swift and painful decline. So, as you can see, a pattern is starting to emerge with the two successful railroads. They had strong management that grew the railroad, but didn't overextend themselves. They made sure they always had good through traffic. One became part of a quasi-syndicate, cartel, whatever you want to call it, and then merged into one company. And the other one always had through traffic from the Union Pacific. And one of them shed unprofitable routes to rid itself of the cost. And I'm guessing they used some of the proceeds to keep the more profitable routes in good repair in hopes of better days to come. I also will make in the note that the Chicago Northwestern did go through a bankruptcy in the Depression like a lot of other railroads did. The difference is what they did after World War II. The other major saving grace the Chicago Northwestern had, along with the CB&Q, was the connection to the Powder River Basin. This gave them access to a huge amount of new traffic, which meant a lot more money for them. And this gave both them and the Burlington Northern a major shot in the arm. And one point I will continue to make is that no one thing saved these two railroads. It was a mix of factors, of which good management was one of them, and probably the thing that helped them the most. The increased traffic from the Powder River Basin just further compounded the good aspects of the railway that kept them alive through the darker days of the 70s. So what went wrong with the Rock Island and the Milwaukee Road? This is a bit of a long story. Both railways were facing stiff competition, stagnating traffic, bad management, and way more track than they both needed. But there were still some differences, and I'll go over some of them here. With Rock Island, they needed traffic from other sources to survive. Their main online traffic source was agriculture, and that was declining quickly following World War II, and they didn't have much else. I'm sure there was other traffic of note, but none of it that made the historical record that I could find online, at least. According to one source that I found, according to it, the Rock Islands also stopped buying land next to their tracks to use for industrial development at some point in their history, and that may or may not have been a good idea. Railroads would act as industrial development firms, and this was mostly to generate traffic from, the railway or from the factories shipping things. Some of this is wishful thinking, I believe, on this person's part, since Iowa and a lot of other Midwestern states really aren't industrial powerhouses these days, and to some extent weren't in the golden age of the Midwest. So I can understand why the Rock Island didn't invest much in land speculation for industrial development in states like Iowa, and to some extent like Oklahoma and Colorado. Same source also has claimed that the Rock Island didn't own some of the track in and around its major cities, and they left this business to terminal railways. I know for sure that they didn't have their own direct access into Denver, and they actually got into it through trackage rights over the UP, so I'm not surprised that they might have used trackage rights or other railways to get stuff into major cities, which is kind of like how internet works. The ISP that you pay is the one that owns the last mile, and the owners that own the last mile make more than the companies that do the bulk transmission over thousands of miles, which would make sense why this would hurt them. So to put it bluntly, the Rock Island needed through traffic, and it didn't have its own sources of industrial traffic. Their solution, like every other railroad in this part of the country at this point in time, was to merge with someone else that already had the traffic, and they settled that on their only option, one and only option, I might add, as being the UP. Not one of many partners, as I said, the one, the only. They applied to merge in 1964, and the ICC drug its feet for 10 years because of protests of other railroads, notably the Chicago Northwestern, the Milwaukee Road, and the Burlington. The Rock Island's management deferred maintenance at this time to make their books look better, which meant their tracks weren't maintained well, and by the time the ICC approved the merger in 1974, the UP walked away because of how bad of shape its tracks were in. The Milwaukee Road, on the other hand, was facing different problems. The Pacific Extension never lived up to its forecasted traffic, and this left them up to their collective years in debt, which brings me back to the pattern the Milwaukee Road was in throughout its history. It had too much track and way too little business, and Charles Elliott Perkins was right in a sense that the need for another Transcon in 1900 was kind of unnecessary, and the traffic for the Milwaukee Road never materialized, and the debt it used to expand before World War I basically did it in from a financial perspective. The Milwaukee Road, from looking at its maps at least, had a far denser network and far more competitors than the Rock Island had, at least relatively speaking, which also put it in a bad long-term position before it took on the debt to construct the Pacific Extension, which it thought would be the one and only thing that would keep them afloat, which leads most people on forums to conclude that Pacific Extension on its own killed the Milwaukee Road in the long term. The part of the story that gets ignored in this retelling of the story, at least, is that the part about the Milwaukee Road using a crapload of debt to buy smaller railroads to have feeders for the Pacific Extension, and that it absorbed a heavily indebted railroad in Indiana, which also, again, just threw more debt onto them, which brings me to their major similarity. The major similarity is that both of them being poorly managed. Both railways were building new routes and were absorbing lots of debt after 1900, which is after the railroad industry at least to the people at the time, had hit its maturity. The Milwaukee Road built the Pacific Extension in 1906, and the Choctaw Route was built in the early 1900s. Now, these didn't completely do them in, and I will argue that the Choctaw Route made the most sense between the two, but it did saddle them in debt at a time when railroads were effectively hitting their peak. As I mentioned, the Western Pacific also built their main line at this time, but as mentioned, they were breaking a monopoly rather than a duopoly, so there would always be some traffic since a lot of people in California really hated the Southern Pacific and would do anything to not ship over them. So the Western Pacific had much more to live for, so to speak. But anyways, what this led to with respect to the Rock Island and Milwaukee Road was bankruptcy, reorganization, and receivership over a good part of the peak of U.S. railroads. The Milwaukee Road went through bankruptcy and reorganization between 1925 and 1928, and again between 1935 and 1945. The second one was due to the Depression and the subsequent fall in its already insufficient traffic and mounting debt, even after its first reorganization. And the Rock Island went into bankruptcy and receivership between 1933 and 1945. For the Rock Island, this was also known as the Farrington era, which is when it improved the most as a business, at least post-1900s business, and was put on a relatively stable path that it remained on until the mid-1960s. The Rock Island also had one other major bankruptcy and reorganization in its history, but this was also at a time when the railroads were young, and like every other railroad and their brother was going through a bankruptcy and reorganization at this point. For example, I think the UP also went through a couple bankruptcies and reorganizations between like the First World War and 1869, and it's still around, so going through a bankruptcy before then didn't really mean too much. So both railroads went through bankruptcy and receivership in the peak of the railroad industry due to debt and falling revenue. The second major thing they had in common was they were always second-tier railroads in their respective markets. Wherever they went, they got there last, and their markets tended to be less populated than the competition. This hurt the Milwaukee Road a lot more than the Rock Island. The Rock Island had more through traffic than the Milwaukee Road, and its primary routes largely survive on to this day because of it. But that didn't help them when they were still playing catch-up against the Burlington, the Santa Fe, and to some extent the Missouri Pacific. The Milwaukee Road tried to catch up with the Great Northern and Northern Pacific, but they never really did. And this was because a good chunk of their roading was in fairly unpopulated territory. Part of the problem was, for better or worse, the Pacific Extension was built after the period of mass immigration was slowing down, so they couldn't do some imperialism with the newly conquered land like the Northern Pacific or even Great Northern could. In this case, 15 years really did make a difference. This pattern of poor management decisions continued into the 1960s when the industry was well into its period of decline. Both railroads saw mergers as the only way to save themselves and that their only option was the Union Pacific. I classify this as a bad decision because the Union Pacific had the Chicago Northwestern to handle most of their through traffic, which gave them a big incentive to fight the possibility of merging the UP with either the Rock Island or the Milwaukee Road. Since both the Milwaukee Road and Rock Island were looking to merge in the 60s, they decided to make their books look good by deferring maintenance and adding what would have been spent on maintenance to the bottom line. What happened is that both the Rock Island and Milwaukee Road's tracks conditions just continued to decline, and by 1970, which is at least the reason why the UP cited as why it wouldn't merge with either of them, or why BN wouldn't take any of the Milwaukee Road either for that matter. Not to mention that BN at the time didn't really need the extra track capacity. And why I consider this a bad decision is because they, as businesses, stopped focusing on their fundamentals. I know it's because of the time in history, the late 60s, early 70s was a very dark time, and basically everyone thought railways were going to die as an industry. But that doesn't mean you just don't focus on your fundamentals, of which for them would have been maintaining their profitable routes, abandoning unprofitable routes, and potentially finding other merger partners besides the Union Pacific. And this is also me talking from a business perspective. These were businesses at the time, and they were likelihood of any sort of nationalization beyond Amtrak wasn't going to happen. And Amtrak and Conrail were more or less done begrudgingly, which is also why Amtrak is pretty lackluster to this day, and Conrail didn't last forever. They were stopgaps, not any long-term policy solution. So what could have gone differently for these two struggling Grangers? So brief overview, the premise of this is I'm throwing out the possibility of the Rock Island or Milwaukee Road merging with the Union Pacific or Burlington Northern. Mostly because historically this didn't happen, and it would just make this a lot less interesting if we went down the road of they just had the easy path. Some of these are going to be my opinion, and some of these are going to be ideas that I've seen other people thrown out before. So to let you know, some of these may not be 100% original, and some of these may be mine. Some of these may be, I think I've already went over this in one of the past videos, but anyways, we'll just get into it. So the first option that I usually see come up in railroad forums and just in my personal research is that one of the options to fix these railways was to merge the Milwaukee Road and the Rock Island into one company. The logic behind this being that they are both ailing companies that needed economy of scale to survive. The premise is based almost entirely on that economies of scale alone could have saved them and that they could have survived on their collective existing revenue. The problem with that is that the Rock Island was dealing with stagnant revenue and a declining number of agricultural customers. On top of that after they had gotten a little bit over the merger bug, they at least seemed to have enough revenue to start modernizing, even though very haphazardly and slowly it may have been, and we'll get to that in a moment when we get to their final days and that discussion around that. The Milwaukee Road also had its own set of problems, is that it had a lot of mileage and wasn't generating enough traffic on its own. So combining the two companies that were having a very hard time surviving on their own likely wouldn't save them. Especially, we'll get into Milwaukee Road's final days problems in a minute. It would be one thing also if they had a decent relationship from each other, and in my digging, the only relationship that they had business-wise was that they shared a railroad terminal in Minneapolis. And also kind of option 2B and 2C or 1B and 1C on this rather. It's either them getting kind of the Conrail treatment and forcibly consolidated into one giant public-ish company, or one or both of them, or maybe just the Milwaukee Road being absorbed into Conrail proper. And from what I understand, this may have actually been seriously floated, at least for the Milwaukee Road, to absorb them into Conrail. But again, I really don't see that actually happening, since the Conrail management only really cared to save the Penn Central parts of its network. So I don't really think the Milwaukee Road would have gotten any different than it had, which would have been just being hacked to bits and eventually sold off. On the Rock Island side of things, is that I think the Rock Island's most likely saving grace would have been it merging directly with the Southern Pacific. The Rock Island and SP worked together to run the Golden State Limited between LA and Chicago, along with other passenger trains along the Golden State route. And they also had overlap in Texas and other parts of the Southwest and South. So they would have had some, synergies, meaning that they could have generated, possibly at least, through traffic between the West Coast and the East. Or to put it more shortly, the SP always needed a more direct route to Chicago and other Midwestern cities. And the SP did buy the Golden State route from the Rock Island's bankruptcy sale. At least the Cotton Belt technically did, but it was a subsidiary. And we're not getting into the whole Russian nesting dolls of that, but it would make sense that the SP or Cotton Belt would have absorbed the Rock Island and then sent traffic over its system. And if also this were to happen, I could see the Rio Grande being absorbed into the Southern Pacific after the Union Pacific, Western Pacific, Missouri Pacific triple merger, which would have made the SP a much bigger transcontinental railroad and would have allowed them to compete more directly with the Union Pacific, even though the UP at the time wouldn't have been a full transcontinental railroad until it acquired the Chicago Northwestern in 1995. But this would have been, I think, the third or so mega merger in the U.S., the first two being BN and Penn Central, should the SP and the Rock Island have merged. Might have actually technically been second if this happened in the 60s and before BN, but again, we're getting into the weeds here. There is also a little bit of support for this option because part of the UP merger proposal was to sell the southern parts of the Rock Island to the Southern Pacific, which would have given the SP the Golden State route at least as far as Kansas City, the Choctaw route, and the various routes in between them. So I could see a little bit less desperate and more intelligent Rock Island getting fed up with the ICC dragging its feet and possibly convincing Don Russell to merge with them and possibly giving the UP some trackage rights into Chicago. But I think that would be the most it would have, because I don't think, other than the UP complaining about this, I don't think any of the other railways would have really cared about this, considering it would have kept the balance in Omaha the same, and the UP would still have to interchange with someone. And as I said, considering this is like an option that kind of was going to sort of half happen with the Union Pacific merger, and if a full merger between the SP and Rock Island had gone through or had been proposed, it wouldn't have upset the balance of traffic in Omaha. So I do think this actually would be the most viable option for them. And as I said, again, there was actually support for this. So the next option, and we're going to bounce back to the Milwaukee Road on this one, was for them to start acting more like the Chicago Northwestern at this time frame, which would have been shedding as many unprofitable routes as it could and potentially finding another merger partner. When the Milwaukee Road went through its final reorganization, it shed a lot of its tracks, which was up to 75%, including the Pacific Extension, at least west of Miles City, Montana, or is it Terry? Not really sure which, because I did not put it in the notes. Anyways, if the Milwaukee Road management had decided to batten down the hatches and shed track on its own terms, it could have stood a better chance of surviving on its own. It needed to shed track to save money on maintenance and taxes and all the other fun stuff that come along with it, and focus on its core routes that made it the most money. The only way it could really do this is, frankly, to shed its money pit routes instead of trying to get the UP to merge with it. And I am aware that prior to the 3Rs Act and the 4Rs Act, which were the first couple rounds of deregulation, shedding rail miles was a long and laborious process. But what is very par for the course for the Milwaukee Road at the time is that their management didn't seriously explore any other options aside from merging with the UP, at least any options that have made it into the historical record. Well, online historical record. I mean, I'm sure there's probably I know there's a few random books out there that chronicle this history far more in depth than most stuff online, but I unfortunately don't have access to those because pandemic and small library system. So unfortunately, those books will remain a mystery to me. So what do I think is the most likeliest alternate history for these railroads based on what I have mentioned? I honestly don't think a Rock Island Milwaukee Road merger would have gone anywhere, and it would have probably just been laughed out of the room. Neither would any level of nationalization for them. And the reason being is that the U.S. had the Soviet Union as an ideological foe. And, yada, 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 anti-communism in the U.S. wasn't going to do anything to save, face or to save companies because it wasn't in the ideology to do that. And they were fine with letting companies die to prove that fact, which isn't to say that saving the Milwaukee Road would have been a good or bad thing. Just saying. But BN could do the same work as far as the government was concerned, and everyone thought railroads were dying anyways, so there was kind of like an attitude of why bother saving a couple. I know the government did save Penn Central, but it was more politically connected than most of the Western railroads were. So my best guess as to what could have happened is, if the Rock Island management was a little less desperate and a little bit wiser, is that they would have waited for about 2-ish years for ICC approval, gotten annoyed with them not actually doing their job, and called off the merger sometime in 1966, while at the same time, behind the scenes, it would have tried to warm up to Don Russell and the SP leadership to get a merger done behind the scenes, or possibly do it with a cotton belt if Don Russell was less than willing to, which would, frankly, with what his attitude was, it has been reported from what little I can find, would not surprise me if he would have been against merging the Rock Island into SP proper, and would have probably maybe been amenable to the cotton belt doing it, but who really knows? And as I said earlier, it probably would have been the best for them, since it wouldn't have upset the balance at Omaha. So I doubt the other railways would have cared as much if the Rock Island got replaced with the SP or the St. Louis and Southwestern in Omaha. And this would also have the knock-on effect of making the SP system far larger than it was and turned it into a transcontinental system, along with potentially drawing the Rio Grande into its orbit before, I think it was his name, Anschutz, got involved with it. Which, as mentioned before, would have made sense as a retaliatory purchase when the UP merged with the Western Pacific and Missouri Pacific in the 80s. I would also like to note that the SP CEO, Benjamin Biagini, who was running the SP from like the later part of the 60s up through the 80s, also kind of fell into the same folly as the Rock Island and Milwaukee Road leadership, which was that they needed a merger to save them. And Don Russell ran things, I will say, unimaginatively, and killed off their passenger division, but Biagini was also a lot less confident in general, it seems, and also this was as mentioned earlier in the video, the railways were going into this dark period, and even if they hadn't fully entered the storm clouds yet, they knew they could very much see them on the horizon. But if this had happened behind the scenes before Don Russell was out, this would have at least made a merger with a comparable sized railroad impossible, so the Southern Pacific Santa Fe merger would never have been on the table. In the case of the SP or the St. Louis and Southwestern merging with the Rock Island. As for what would happen to the Milwaukee Road in this situation, I can see this going in about 3 different directions. The first being that nothing really changes other than the Rock Island is out of the picture and wouldn't be getting in the way of them merging with the UP, so they'd basically double down on their fight with the Chicago Northwestern over their potential merger. And or after 1971, them trying to get absorbed into BN. I know I wasn't going to mention things wouldn't really change options, but given how things were going, I kind of figured this would be a more likely one for them. Anyways, the second path I could see happening is that after an SP Rock Island merger, the opening of the was it the BN gateways or the Northwestern gateways, whatever one that gave the Milwaukee Road trackage rights over BN after their merger, I could see them pestering maybe the SP or the St. Louis and Southwestern to merge with them or buy them out or do something. But given, as I said, how timid Ben Biagini was at running the SP, he frankly wasn't any better than anyone else running things in the industry at that time. I mean, better considering the railroad survived a lot longer, but still not better than, say, the people running the Chicago Northwestern or the UP. That being said, the Milwaukee Road was in very bad shape, which would mean the SP having to pump a lot of money into it to make it worthwhile, assuming they didn't do the land liquidation and reinvestment thing at some point, like this Chicago Northwestern did. And the third path I could see them is just going through the liquidation and reinvestment path while trying to find other merger partners other than the SP or BN or UP, which honestly would probably make the most sense as far as being a business goes. Seeing the Rock Island merge with somebody other than the UP, and if the merger was reasonably successful, might push them to consider their options, which hopefully would have led to a slightly more stable, if not smaller, railroad. Part of what could hinder that is that management not wanting to risk being downgraded to a Class 2 railroad just to survive. Pride's a bitch. And as for other partners, I could see them possibly going for like the Illinois Central, the Kansas City Southern, Canadian Pacific. And I'm not sure who would take them besides the Canadian Pacific or the Kansas City Southern, but again, this is just kind of a just general opinion. So a slight tangent about the Kansas City Southern, besides its announced intention to either merge with Canadian Pacific or Canadian National at this time while I'm recording this. There was a time where it actually did nearly buy the Southern Pacific. So after the SP Santa Fe merger failed and was, just collapsed, they were governed by the same holding company. And after the ICC declined their merger, the new Santa Fe holding company sold the SP off and kept its various subsidiaries like Sprints, which is the company that T-Mobile bought a couple years back. And they left the railway to fend for itself. And the SP was basically already not in a very good position at this point, and it barely got through the dark days itself with its very indecisive and timid management. And the Kansas City Southern was one of two companies that bid to buy the SP from Santa Fe, and the Rio Grande was the one that won the bidding process. And as the story goes, the CEO of Santa Fe told the owner of the Rio Grande to put up more money before hanging up on him, to which Anschutz at this point did, and put up an extra $100 million over Kansas City Southern's bid, and they just didn't try to beat him, and which is how the Rio Grande ended up controlling the SP. And the reason why they did that was they assumed the Kansas City Southern, if they bought the Southern Pacific, would cut off through traffic from California. So there was actually precedent for the Kansas City Southern at this time wanting to possibly buy other railroads at a bargain. And if a much better Milwaukee Road retrenched itself and stabilized, I could see them potentially considering a smaller Milwaukee Road as a viable partner, assuming it avoided bankruptcy in the 80s, of course. Because this would have been at the time when most railways were looking to gobble up their neighbors, or not really neighbors, but railways that were a little further away from them that they could have linked up with. As for what would have happened going forward with the new Southern Pacific, they wouldn't have tried to merge with the Santa Fe, and either trying to or wouldn't have even been on the table, considering the ICC would have had more obvious reasons to reject it than they did. Like, the competition thing was, I think it was a kind of dumb reason to deny the merger, in my personal opinion. But at the same time, if the Rock Island and Southern Pacific had merged, it would have been. And this wouldn't have been on the table because the Southern Pacific would have gotten out of the Rock Island whatever it wanted out of the SP, or the Santa Fe rather, which was access to Midwestern cities. Not to mention the regulatory environment wouldn't have considered this merger at all, as I mentioned, because it would have definitely reduced competition in a lot more states than the SP Santa Fe merger would, despite offering to give BN and UP trackage rights. About the most it could have gotten out of a Santa Fe merger following a Rock Island merger would have been consolidation of traffic in the Southwest and California, where they would have had overlapping lines and no other competition besides, well, at least rail competition. But that's about it. And assuming they were both profitable, consolidating some main lines wouldn't have helped them that much either. And my best guess is that the SP would have remained a relatively stable railroad into the 90s, assuming they had their subsidiaries intact and managed them a lot better, even if they had to partially spin a bunch of them off. Kind of just run them with a light hand. But this could have been, a successful enough railroad to maybe stand a chance against the Union Pacific and Burlington Northern, basically remaining about as stable as the Kansas City Southern. And as to what have happened between 95 and 2001, I'm not really sure, and I'm not going to really delve too far into that. I do think the UP and Chicago Northwestern would have merged anyways, regardless, and especially there would also have been much more pressure to do so with the Rock Island being owned by the SP at this point. But as for what would have happened with the competing Burlington Northern, Southern Pacific, Santa Fe, and Union Pacific, I'm not really sure if they would have considered consolidating into two like we have now. And I could easily see them stabilizing into a warring states like status quo, where they can't really make a move on each other, but none of them are really going to fail either. Or they could have merged into a familiar arrangement, so I'm not really sure. But what would have been a smarter path for the Milwaukee Road on top of all of the retrenchment idea would have been them taking more advantage out of the BN merger to get more out of it. They did get trackage rights from Portland from Spokane and up to the Canadian border at Sumas. If they had added the Northern Pacific Main Line along with the Burlington connection from Omaha, they could have also stood a better chance at surviving, seeing as how the Northern Pacific Main Line had better stretches in some parts of the Milwaukee Road route in some points. And this also kind of just shows how, frankly, short-sighted the Milwaukee Road management was and how uncommitted to competition, quote-unquote, the U.S. government is. The Milwaukee Road was, quote-unquote, competition to BN, but only in the sense that it existed, not that it was effective competition or would even survive in the long term. And by then, the Milwaukee Road had already seen the writing on the wall. So in a timeline where, again, the Rock Island and SP merged, and because of the Rock Island's impatience, and hopefully if the Milwaukee Road got shocked into changing course, they might have survived. Surviving is good, which could have meant preserving the Pacific extension, which could be a good thing now, since Tacoma and Seattle are very busy cargo ports, and the BNSF lines are fairly crowded, and the Milwaukee Road line over Snoqualmie Pass is still abandoned. So at least having their line out of the Puget Sound area would be useful had the Milwaukee Road downsized under its own steam rather than being shredded in a bankruptcy court. The one thing that I will say that I do think about the Milwaukee Road would have gotten bought out at some point by another railroad. Unlike a Southern Pacific Rock Island merger, which could possibly have threaded the needle between the dark days in the Staggers Act and the days that came later, I don't really think the Milwaukee Road could have had, or at least would have had, the same case to be on their own forever. Had it retrenched and used the proceeds to modernize itself, it still would have been left with a network with a poorer profile in some places and very few, if any, subsidiaries, because I can't really find any of note. At least, at least compared to the SP before the aborted merger with the Santa Fe. So assuming the retrenchment plan managed to preserve the Pacific extension, it would have been a matter of time for another railroad other than Burlington Northern would have seen it as a potential target to buy to gain access to Puget Sound. And as I said, my bet would be either on Kansas City Southern or Canadian Pacific. But that, again, is just my guess. CP did buy the Milwaukee Road from the bankruptcy court. And as I mentioned, the KCS wasn't against expanding at this point. And for them, it would have at least given them a connection to the Pacific Northwest from New Orleans. So that would also possibly be attractive. And the CP having an auxiliary route to the Pacific, again, also could be seen as a good thing. So to move on to one last little bit of analysis on the Milwaukee Road before we get to the actual history and start closing this out, and before hopefully someone pounds out an angry comment over the last section, I am going to cover a little bit about the Milwaukee Road and whether or not it could have actually survived given its position in the industry. So factors people talk about with the Milwaukee Road is that it could have survived or was brought down for conspiratorial reasons. And this conspiracy was orchestrated by the leaders of the Great Northern. And that the Milwaukee Road had a lot of positive factors going for it, which include the Milwaukee Road having the best engineered route for the time, electric operations always being better, their route being shorter, and that they had a direct connection to Chicago, unlike the other two hill lines, because they had to use the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy as their bridge between the Twin Cities and Chicago. The long and short of this is the Milwaukee Road was able to benefit from advances in technology. For example, it having better grades over the Pacific extension than the Northern Pacific had, even though it had more of them. This being a mixed hand for them, and frankly for any railroad it would have been. Another thing that is also highlighted is electrification. Electrification was good when the railroad was built, but became a problem after dieselization. It's a good thing, but you do also need a lot of it because there's network externalities. Having a few hundred miles of it with a gap in the middle is not a very efficient system, and taking the time to swap locomotives became an inefficiency, after dieselization, because you'd have to stop and unhook the engines or hook new ones on. And considering how just isolated some of these locomotives were, it's not like you could just move them throughout the system. And modern railroading, especially after dieselization, you tended to just use whatever you hook on at the start and run it all the way through to the end. In the steam age, it frankly wasn't uncommon to swap engines before and after mountains. And nowadays, it's just common to hook up engines at their, not terminating yard, but beginning yard and running it all the way through to the end. I will say, though, the undisputed best pass the Milwaukee Road had was Snoqualmie Pass through the Cascade Mountains. GN, on the other hand, did have a basically flatter route for the entire part of its route once you got past, I think, Idaho. Can't remember exactly where their pass is, but it's somewhere in Idaho. Or no, wait, it's near Glacier National Park's their last big one, sorry. I haven't remembered back to the videos I made, and I did not write this in my notes. But basically, railroads always want the flattest grade possible, and GN kind of got that, even though it didn't really have a lot of online traffic either. On that note, it's also occasionally brought up that the Milwaukee Road had shorter routes between various cities than the competing routes. The problem with that is that the worst mileage for the Hill Lines was maybe 200 or more, a little bit over 200 miles more than Milwaukee Road routes. And 200 miles in a 2,000-mile journey really isn't that huge of a distance that can't be overcome with technology or geographical features, such as running over a much flatter route. Not to mention that over time, the Hill Lines did upgrade their routes a lot more than the Milwaukee Road did, and stick a pin in that point. So, those advantages, at least the Milwaukee Road had compared to the Great Northern and Northern Pacific, were overcome with technology eventually, which is something the Milwaukee Road didn't really seem to do. So now we're going to get into a little bit more, I guess melancholy is a better way, because this isn't really a positive thing, nor is it a sad thing, but it's more of a thing that actually could have made a bit of a difference in the Milwaukee Road's history. Is that as I dug through a lot of the history and what people have said and what people have written and what a few of their employees and whatnot have said, is that their ability to survive was very much hindered with all the long-term debt they had, partially because of the Pacific Extension. Milwaukee Road was in $257 million of debt in 1909 after the Pacific Extension was opened. Part of this was due to it absorbing a bunch of mining and logging railroads and a heavily leveraged railroad in Indiana during this time period, and their debt load would be the equivalent of about $7 billion today. Through the Milwaukee Road's bankruptcies, this debt was never knocked down, from what I can tell, or at least not significantly for that matter. When companies go through bankruptcy, they do so to restructure and discharge debts in an attempt to perform better post-bankruptcy. Not discharging some of the debts is weird. Things that could have been done would have been to just tell the bondholders to deal with losing money, or they could have swapped debt for equity. And this is actually, at least the secondary one, is actually a normal practice. So a little more recent historical event. When American Airlines went bankrupt following the 2008 recession and subsequently merged with U.S. Airways, part of the deal was that the bondholders of American would get stock in the new merged company in exchange for taking a haircut on the bonds. So it's actually kind of unusual that the bondholders of the Milwaukee Road didn't do something like this in 1925 to reduce their debt from $257 million down to, say, 20 or 57 million, and that the difference have been converted into stock in the reorganized railroad. And according to at least one person's recounting of a book that I don't have access to, the Milwaukee Road's management did this with some debt, but instead of stock, the bondholders got preferred stock with guaranteed dividends with no sunset clause, and if they weren't paid for 6 consecutive months, they could fire the board and all C-level managers. And if this were true, the managers of this company were just beyond inept at running anything. Another side note is that the Milwaukee Road, I'm not entirely sure exactly how this went because there was a bit of a bond scandal in the late 1850s in Wisconsin. So I don't know if this is a railroad the Milwaukee Road absorbed or is a railroad they had already absorbed who had done this. But anyways, apparently this railroad was known for giving out bonds and selling them off. And when it went bankrupt, it basically didn't pay any of them. And the Wisconsin basically went through a massive recession as a state because of this. And I'm not entirely sure if this was, again, the Milwaukee Road had absorbed them before they sold the bonds and the Milwaukee Road just never made good on them, or was this done afterward and the Milwaukee Road was also directly responsible for this. But some people think that for some reason this 1857 scandal and bankruptcy somehow reflected on the Milwaukee Road, a good 50 years later, when they were going through their first bankruptcy in 1925. Considering that what life expectancy would have been back then, it's like you're talking someone would have had to have been like the child or grandchild of someone who would have been, frankly, my age, and I'm 27 at this point, so you're talking someone like my grandchild is going to have to hold a vendetta against a company 50 years down the line and then do something to screw them. Like, that is just like a very harebrained, I don't even know how to describe that kind of a borderline conspiracy theory. I mean, it's almost as nonsensical as somehow the Great Northern's executives orchestrated the entire collapse of the Milwaukee Road. But anyways, that insanity aside, what the Milwaukee Road never getting its debts discharged or converted into equity ended up spawning was an arrangement that basically kept him in a state of perpetual financial collapse. Never getting the lion's share of the debt canceled and swapped for equity basically meant they never had financial breathing room to put money into maintaining their railroad. This would be reflected in the shape the Milwaukee Road was in after 1957 when their attempt at post-war modernization ended. A large chunk of the Milwaukee Road didn't have centralized traffic control, remote control sidings, long sidings that would handle modern trains or even what were becoming long trains then. They had very little double track over their main lines, and they didn't have hot box detectors along with their track being in relatively bad shape. And at the same time, the hill lines were modernizing. They were embracing newer means of running the railroad. They had double tracked. They had at least rerouted around some of the worst parts of the original routes, installing new technology. And this basically ended up with Milwaukee Road running still as a 1920s railroad over most of its territory into the 70s. And a lot of this is down to them being stuck in debt and never really being able to modernize. The Pacific Extension may have been the most advanced railway in the country in 1912, but it basically stayed that way until the electric infrastructure was scrapped in the 70s, meaning they didn't undertake the modernization that the Northern Pacific and Great Northern did, mostly just because they never really had the money to. And all of this enabled the Milwaukee Road's competitors to overcome any advantages they may have had through operational improvements. And with how narrow some of these advantages were and how fast technology advanced, it was only a matter of time for the Northern Pacific and Great Northern improved enough to close the gap. So the best case scenario would have been enabling the Milwaukee Road to survive, would have been just getting their debt canceled and swapped for equity. Less that would have given them the breathing room to modernize their own right-of-way, and along with that, they could have better exploited the BN merger. And I know this is one of the things that I also have to bring up a little bit when it comes to logistics. How do I put this succinctly? Sometimes with logistics, speed doesn't really matter. It's the reliability of it. And one of the main issues the Milwaukee Road had towards the end was it wasn't very reliable. So even if the Milwaukee Road modernized and was still managing to hold on to its schedules, even if it was, say, I think maybe 5 hours slower than a BN train, or at least their faster trains, that's not enough to kill them. Frankly, if the Milwaukee Road was actually reliable, let's say holding a 60-hour Chicago to Seattle piggyback trailer operation consistently, that would have been fine. Even if the BN, I think they cut like 5 hours off their journey time, it still would have been fine. The major issue would have been the hills. If they couldn't somehow sweeten the deal for people shipping things, that would have been a problem. But anyways, that aside, and we'll get to closing out this chapter. So one of the normal places I tend to like going with this channel, and a lot of things that involve politics in general, is that normally one big thing can't make or break something, mostly because the world is just never that simple. But in this case, their hasty decision to buy up basically every heavily leveraged railroad to act as feeders really hurt the Milwaukee Road. The Pacific Extension was always going to be a gamble for them, but they took way more risks to build it than they frankly should have. Not every bet was a good bet, but their management seemed to not leave a single option on the table. And this short-sighted mindset seemed to have just continued with them all the way down the road till the end. The Rock Island, by comparison, had some bad managers over the years, but also had some really good ones before they caught the merger bug. The Rock Island had periods where they would put money back into modernizing themselves. This and having more traffic from the SP enabled them to survive in the long term. Even with how terrible of shape the former Rock Island lines were in the 1980s when they went under, the Chicago Northwestern and the Southern Pacific still wanted them, along with other investors. The Milwaukee Road, on the other hand, ended up with like 70-ish% of its railroad abandoned due partially to how bad a shape they were in. And even if there was arguably a need to preserve parts of the Pacific Extension west of Miles City, Montana, whoever would have bought them would have had to spend millions, if not billions at this point, because it would have been the 80s, to bring the track up to modern standards. It just would have been just not worth it for a lot of people. Or to be more blunt about it, the best engineered route doesn't mean much if the rest of the infrastructure eventually falls to crap. And as bad as shape as the Rock Island was in, the routes were more or less as well engineered and far more modernized by comparison, and still in use by a lot of other people, despite their problem with getting traffic of their own. Another minor point that I have to show, because it kind of goes here and it doesn't really go anywhere else as far as the Milwaukee Road is concerned, is that at least one source that I found, citing a book at least, alleged that the Milwaukee Road double counted the cost of running and maintaining the Pacific Extension, and in the last few years of its existence, it actually made a profit. But again, we'll keep a pin in that segment. It's something I have to bring up, and we just will for the time being. So it's hopefully no secret, if you're watching this video or listening to it, that the Rock Island and the Milwaukee Road both went under. And before I end this, I am going to talk a little bit about how they met their respective ends. And I'll start off with the Rock Islands. The Rock Island, after being set adrift by the Union Pacific in 1974, entered bankruptcy about a year later. The railroad did what it could to make plans to reorganize and rebuild the railroad, which was an attempt to reverse the cost of their deferred maintenance, which was a policy they were pursuing for the decade or so while they were trying to merge with the Union Pacific. During the first phase of the bankruptcy, the Crown family, which is a major rich family in the Chicago area, bought up the largest amount of the Rock Island's debt at junk prices after the company entered bankruptcy. Henry Crown, who was the main person in all this, immediately pushed for liquidation proceedings instead of reorganization. Being the largest bondholder and the railroad still having a lot of valuable real estate meant he and other bondholders would get a nice payday if liquidation happened. But the Rock Island was allowed to soldier on, and it started rebuilding its trackage and engines. This was starting to show some success, and according to a person who oversaw some of their crews, one crew was replacing 500 ties worth of track per day on a shoestring budget, since the railroad was still facing a very rocky financial, existence, so to speak. On top of this, there were other problems afoot with respect to the company's finances. All of their agreements with various unions had expired, and the employees had kept working even though they were getting paid under the terms of the old contracts and weren't getting yearly pay increases. So in 1979, the railroad sat the unions down, this being the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and the United Transportation Union, to audit the railroad's books. After seeing this, they then agreed to a new contract, which, from the sound of it, was less generous than the railroad employee contract would have been in the past, and the pay increases wouldn't be retroactive to when the last contract expired. The thorn in this plan was the Brotherhood of Airline and Railway Clerks. They didn't want to agree to a contract that wouldn't have retroactive pay increases, and their leader refused to audit the books to see how bad the railroad was doing at this time. So they called a strike in August of 1979, and the railroad ground to a halt. The management of the railroad still tried to keep the railroad running, and by November, they were projected to carry half of their pre-strike tonnage with only 5% of the railroad's workforce on the job, and making a profit of about $5 million per month. The outstanding union tried to get the Federal Rail Administration, the ICC, and the Carter administration to intervene and shut the railroad down to force them back to the table. And the ICC declared a state of emergency and put the Rock Island's operations in the hands of the Kansas City Terminal Railway, claiming they wouldn't be able to handle the grain harvest despite carrying close to 80% of their pre-strike tonnage by the time the emergency was declared. And on January 24th, 1980, the judge overseeing the bankruptcy proceedings decided to not hear the railroad's plans to reorganize and started the liquidation proceedings. What followed was the Rock Island and its principal routes being sold off or completely abandoned in a sale. The Southern Pacific, through its Cotton Belt subsidiary, bought the Golden State route from Tucumcari to Kansas City, along with the route between St. Louis and Kansas City, as well as the Chicago Northwestern buying the quote-unquote spine line from Des Moines to St. Paul, and the line from Chicago to Omaha was bought by the Iowa Interstate Railroad. The Milwaukee Road also was facing a similar demise at the same time. It was shopping for merger partners from 1957 to 1974 and had deferred maintenance to make its books look good. The longest attempt at merging it had was when it attempted to merge with the Chicago Northwestern. Since they were taking their case to the ICC for whatever reason, the Milwaukee Road thought that it would be a good idea to not upset the Hill Lines because they were also attempting to merge, even if the Milwaukee Road could have gotten a lot better concessions out of them than they did. The main consequence of this was, or concessions of this rather, was that they got access to Portland and some other cities along the BN route that they didn't have direct access to. And this did increase traffic on the Pacific Extension, and according to some reporting, the Milwaukee Road took the largest chunk of traffic out of Seattle and Tacoma for a brief stint, and a bunch of traffic from the SP out of Portland. Unfortunately, by 1970, this was too little too late. Extra traffic had helped, but with their policy of deferred maintenance and just the terrible condition of a lot of their routes, due to the railway not having the money to modernize itself as effectively as it would need to, there was just not a lot that could be done to save it at that point. Even with extra traffic, poor finances, and out-of-date deteriorating trackage, it was only a matter of time by then. And between 1974 and 1977, when it entered its final bankruptcy, it lost, between those 3 years, $100 million. And this was when the Milwaukee Road trimmed down from 10,000 miles to just over 3,000. The smaller Milwaukee Road, still in reorganization, started turning a profit in 1982. And since then, the Milwaukee Road was in such a bad position before reorganization, it was just assumed that it wouldn't survive for very long on its own. And at this point, the bankruptcy court decided to sell the Milwaukee Road to someone else. Of the railroads that were around, 3 came to the table. One was the Chicago Northwestern. The other was the Grand Trunk Railroad, which was Canadian National's U.S. subsidiary, and the Soo Line, which was Canadian Pacific's U.S. subsidiary. And the bid from the Soo Line was accepted in 1986. And the remaining parts of the Milwaukee Road were merged into the Soo Line. And a small successor corporation was set up to handle whatever the Soo Line didn't take over. This is also the time where I should note that, according to some, the Milwaukee Road's poor accounting measures actually kept it from saying that it actually did make a profit on the Pacific Extension, despite people saying it was just a complete money sink, which is one of those things where, unfortunately, we can't really know, because if there's, between most of the people that would have been alive and doing this would be dead by now, considering, we're almost 50 years out from the Milwaukee Road being extended, and I'm imagining most of the people were probably in their 50s anyways, so unfortunately there's not that many people that are alive then, so the most we're getting is anecdotes written by people who were either in the room or knew someone who was, that were written in the 80s. So, assuming the railroad actually did have some profitability in the Pacific Extension, its loss actually is kind of a big loss for transportation in this country. Along with just at this point having an extra route out of the Puget Sound area would just be very helpful as far as railroads go. At least that chunk of the Milwaukee Road would have been worth saving. But again, I think what is left of the Pacific Extension in that part of Washington is now just a bunch of branch lines because it got chopped up. But anyways, we'll be moving on into the conclusions here in a moment. So, conclusions. What are they? How many do we have? And whatnot? So, out of the 4 main Granger railroads, only really 2 of them survived more or less unmolested until the mega merger era. The CB&Q is probably the most famous and successful of which, because it was absorbed into the Hill Empire fairly early in its history. The Chicago Northwestern was solidly number 2 on that list, because even though they had suffered through some hardships, they remained on good terms with the Union Pacific and led to their merger in the 1990s. The Rock Island had a storied history, but is definitely number 3 on this list. They didn't survive, but they did have their roots, and the Milwaukee Road is definitely last on this list. It expanded and was eviscerated in a bankruptcy court, and its remains were eventually sold to the Canadian Pacific Railroad, or at least its U.S. subsidiary. And there were other regional carriers like the Chicago and Eastern Illinois and the Chicago Great Western, which didn't fare anywhere near as well as these railways did, but they were regional carriers, and the other 4 were more national carriers, which is why they were the focus of this video. What the 2 that failed had in common was poor management with tunnel vision that eventually drove them into the ground. This tunnel vision was focusing entirely on merging with the Union Pacific to be their eastern connection to Chicago and making themselves seem more attractive. They deferred maintenance and didn't do anything else that could have led to their long-term survival. This is on top of other issues such as taking on excessive debt to grow when the industry was hitting its peak, not integrating closely with other railroads, and not developing ancillary companies to complement their already existing business. Which isn't to say, again, they didn't have their strong suits. The Rock Island definitely did have its strong suits, and had things gone a little differently, they could have either A, survived, or B, have been absorbed into another railroad besides the Union Pacific. And normally I wouldn't argue that one big thing makes or breaks businesses or industries, which in this case it didn't for everyone other than the Milwaukee Road. The only technicality on this point is that it wasn't always the same person making these poor decisions over their 70 years or so of making really bad decisions. The people who took on debt to buy feeder railroads in the 1900s were not the same people who deferred maintenance in the 1970s, but they did help raise a culture of believing in one big thing, whether it be the Pacific Extension, gaining feeder routes, or just merging with the Union Pacific. This mentality basically led to its demise, and to some extent it did in the Rock Island. And as bad of management as some of these companies had, the Hill lines and the Chicago Northwestern Railways managed a lot better. Yeah, they did strike it rich on the Powder River Basin, which is the thing that basically gave them the shot in the arm that let them survive as long as they did, or at least have a more of a reemergence sooner than the other two railways did. Because when the Rock Island was basically slumping into its final bankruptcy is when the Chicago Northwestern was more or less stabilizing into what its form would be until the Union Pacific took it over, and then it hit the Powder River Basin bonanza. So it could have survived on pretty shaky ground too, but that's what the Powder River Basin is what gave it the boost to survive, and kind of the same thing with BN. It also could have survived on its own, even if it was on relatively shaky grounds, but the Powder River Basin was just what gave it basically the cushion to survive. So I know that's one thing I know that also comes up a lot is saying that, oh, Powder River Basin, done deal. There were a lot of factors. The Powder River Basin was a big one, and I will say is it's what made, how do I put this? Most railways at the time were basically treading water, and the Powder River Basin for the Chicago Northwestern and Burlington Northern was basically the thing that just put them over the top. It wasn't necessarily the thing that saved them. But anyways, I'm going to end that here because this has been a monster of a video, and at the time of me recording this conclusion, I'm not entirely sure how long it's going to be, but I hope you did enjoy, and yeah, I don't know if I'll end up doing another longer form one like this anytime soon, but if I do, I will, and if I don't, I will see you when the regularly scheduled videos continue to roll out. Till then, I will see you later.